All right. Thank you all for coming early this morning. I see some of you have coffee. There will be a few more people I saw coming in now, so I think it's time to start, and they'll come in as we have already been underway. Today, this session is looking at the future of transport, and in particular looking at the way in which the International Transport Forum thinks about the future of transport, looking out to 2050. 32 years from now, one generation from now. All of us can measure in generations, and we know that's a long time, but it's also quite a short time. The reason that we undertake this work for our members is to help them understand where different trends may lead them in all modes of transport, in aviation, in maritime, in ground transport, inland navigation, and urban transport. And that is because for a lot of decision makers, a lot of our constituents, our member countries, they have to manage investment portfolios that often span multiple generations. Investment portfolios that require decisions now, but that will have to pay over a long time, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. When you think about one generation, when you think about 2 generations, there is a lot of uncertainty about where transport is going. What we do at the International Transport Forum is not predict the future. We think about different scenarios of what the future may look like and try to draw lessons from that can better guide policy in the present for our member countries. That's the spirit of the Transport Outlook. We are underway now with the production of the next Transport Outlook that will be in 2019. And the theme of that outlook is very much linked to feedback that we've gotten on past exercises, which is basically answering the question, have you thought of this, or did you think of that? What about this trend? Most of those things are disruptive trends, trends that would indicate that the future will not be like the past, that the assumptions that we build into our look into the future are not going to hold because of a change in both travel behavior, a change in the linkage between, a potential change in the linkage between economic activity and travel activity, both on freight and passenger, and a number of other disruptive trends that we feel and that our constituents feel may have an impact on where transport is going in the future. The theme of this outlook, the 2019 outlook, is disruption. We are going to be talking about disruption today. I've got a panel of master disruptors here. I've told them 2 things, that they have to be excellent and they have to be disruptive. But I expect the same from you as well, because after hearing from the ITF on what the outlook has done in the past and what we're looking at in the future, I'll ask each of them for some indication of where they think our assumptions may no longer hold going forward. But I'll very quickly turn to you as well, because this is a session where we want input from you on where you think we're wrong, where you think we are not looking at the right things, where you think we need to be looking at certain trends that we have only marginally looked at in the past. So I will ask you to disrupt this session by bringing in your comments on what you think we should include when we think about how transport will be changing going forward for the next 32 years through 2050. So the panel that we have here today, I'll introduce them and then I'll introduce our first speaker right afterwards, are a number of people who are experts in their field and each coming with their own experience. Starting at the very end, we have Alan McKinnon, professor of logistics at Kuhne Logistics University in Germany, someone that has been involved with the ITF for quite a long time and the ECMT before that. Next to him is Karen van Cloysen, Secretary General of Polis, which is a network bringing together a number of innovative cities in Europe and elsewhere, and that will talk a bit about the urban aspect to disruption. Then we have Timothy Papandreou, founder of City Innovate. And for those of you who know Timothy, you also know that he is just leaving Waymo after having spent 2.5 years there. Before that, he was the Chief Innovation Officer for the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Authority and a passionate thinker about where cities and transport should be going. And I'm sure, Tim, you're going to be disrupting this session quite a bit. Sophie Punte, all of these are really high on all of these, I have to say, are really disruptive speakers. It's going to be hard to manage them. Sophie, as a good introduction, Sophie Punte is the executive director of the Smart Freight Center, and this is a center looking at where the future of freight should be going, especially in terms of sustainability. Marius Maku, Senior Associate Public Policy and Government Relations for the EU at Uber. Many of you have used them. They have certainly changed transport markets in the cities where they're present. And my name is Philippe Christ. I'm with the International Transport Forum as well, as is my colleague who will now come to the stage, Jari Kauppila, who is the head of statistics and modeling at the International Transport Forum. He is the team leader behind the Transport Outlook effort. He'll present the thinking behind the Outlook. He'll present what we're looking at for the next Outlook. I have to say that it's been my great pleasure and misfortune to have shared an office with him for 7 years. But I hope that, I'm sure that he will present a very concise look at where we're going forward. Jari?
Thank you very much, Philip. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Also on my behalf, welcome to the ITF Transport Outlook session. This session has become one of the sort of feature sessions, a regular feature in the ITF Summit, and I'm happy to see so many of your colleagues here this morning again this year. My presentation is going to be quite short. I try not to be too disruptive, so I'll leave the disruption to our distinguished panel here. I'm just going to be a kickoff presentation, talking about some of the assumptions that we have underlying our today's exercise of the ITF Transport Outlook and some of the things we want to look at in the next edition of 2019. Just a couple of words on the ITF Transport Outlook. Philip, you promised to waive the Outlook and give a reward to the most disruptive. Okay, all right, great. It is our flagship publication. It's part of the OECD Outlook series together with the Economic Outlook. We're really looking at a long-term development of global transport volumes up to 2050, related CO2 emissions, health impacts, other sustainable development goals. We have in-house transport models that cover all modes of transport, both freight and passenger, at the different levels of granularity. What we do with it really allows us to look at how world could change if we choose different policies or different development pathways. And we hope that it helps us and helps the decision makers, policy makers, to understand some of the trade-offs and interdependencies of different trends and policies. Now, in the last edition, 2017, we looked at the impact of alternative policies on transport demand, related CO2 emissions and health impacts. That was the focus. We covered all modes of transport already, globally, regionally, nationally, but also in cities. We cover all the cities in the world above 300,000 populations, so it's a very detailed exercise. We also moved beyond the emissions in the Outlook. We looked at connectivity, what is the impact on access to opportunities, and what are the infrastructure needs for future transport demand as well. Now, highlighting some of the key major aggregate trends from the Outlook last year, 2017, and talking a little bit then about the underlying assumptions on those, which we probably want you to challenge, as Philip was saying. Passenger transport will more than double by 2050, according to our baseline scenario. The global car stock, the ownership of private cars will also more than double from 1 billion in 2015 to 2.4 billion cars by 2050 globally. The car ownership in our projections, in our estimations, is still driven by income level, increasing income level, especially in developing economies where the car ownership rates will increase to grow as well. On the freight side, we actually project the freight volumes to triple by 2050. This demand for freight is still primarily driven by economic growth. The trade elasticity, the freight elasticity to GDP is close to 1, so every additional GDP growth is followed by additional movement of goods, a little bit more than the growth in GDP. So we have the annual growth rate. The GDP is growing on an annual growth rate of 2.5 over the period of time from 2015 to 2050, whereas freight demand is growing by 3.1%. Again, are these patterns something that will remain? Do we see this to be the continued pattern as well in the future? The freight patterns, we do project quite a significant changes in trade patterns and related freight patterns globally. Economic center of gravity is moving from Europe, more from North America to East, and the intra-Asian trade will increase significantly over the next 30 years. Also, North Pacific freight between North America, Asia will be increasing, as well as trade and freight movement within the Indian Ocean sphere as well. In terms of CO2 emissions, what we conclude from our last edition of Outlook was that the policies that we have today, all the policies we know, if we apply those in the transport demand that we'll see growing, they are not enough to achieve the climate ambitions, the 2-degree scenarios, or well below 2-degree scenarios. we still see that by 2015, even applying all the possible policies we know today, transport will emit same amount of emissions as CO2 emissions as it's emitting today in the world. So what we conclude that we do need innovations, radical policy changes and choices, shared mobility, changes in potentially supply chains, the way we deliver the transport, the way we deliver goods in the global transport system, and perhaps some new transport modes that are required as well. This comes to the disruption. We don't know those yet, but that's where we are thinking that that is what is needed in order to meet the climate agreement's ambitions. Now, the next edition, 2019 edition of Transport Outlook, is going to focus on disruption, as Philippe was saying. Some of the potential disruptions we are looking at are listed here, whether they're drones, are they electric highways, new trade routes, high-capacity trucks, 3D printing, massive shared mobility, electrification, automation, etc., etc. Some of these disruptions may be less disruptive. I would categorize them in three different categories. Some of the disruption help to produce the same service as we have today, but just more effectively. So is it a disruption? Maybe it's not. It's just another way of improving efficiency. Some of the disruption maybe improve the offer. It improves the service level that we have today. So it does change the way we deliver the services. And then there's some that might actually completely change the way we deliver the transport today. And that's one of the discussions I'd like to hear from the panel today, that which ones they are here that we're looking at it. And for us, in the Outlook 2019, our objective is to better understand the nature of disruption. So what is it? How is it going to change the transport system? And what is the likely timing, the scale, and the potential impact of that disruption on transport system? Those are the kind of issues we're looking at in 2019 Outlook. Just to give a couple of examples of potential disruptions. In the current projections for urban mobility, the mobility and related emissions are really driven by four factors. Socioeconomic factors, the GDP, population, etc., urbanization rate. They depend also on the availability of transport supply, roads, buses, BRTs, metros, active mobility. They also depend on policies that affect that mobility in our modeling exercises, fuel prices, parking prices, etc. And it's also affected by vehicle and fuel efficiency. Now, looking at just two of the disruptions mentioned in the list before, automation and shared mobility, they have a potential impact on several aspects of urban mobility. Shared mobility might have an impact on the ownership rates of cars in the global level. Transit supply, the way we provide the public transport, for example, it should affect the vehicle occupancy rates from the 1.2 average people in the car today, potentially to how much, we don't know. And also, of course, to the modal split. Same for the autonomous vehicles. It might affect the trip rates. How many trips actually we are making? Are we sending the cars going by themselves, making empty trips? The distances, urban sprawl, how the cities might change as a result of automation. These are all the uncertainties that we don't have any answers. And we hope that the panel today will just give us an answers and we just put them in the model and we have a great future ahead of us. And that's perfect. No pressure. On the freight side, just to give a couple of examples of similar underlying assumptions, we, as I said, still assume that freight will grow together with the GDP. But after the 2008 economic crisis, we did see already a quite significant change in the trade elasticity of GDP. Before, every GDP had a 2.43 time growth of trade. Today, that elasticity is somewhere around 1.2, 1.4. So are we seeing less trade happening as growth goes as well? But in our underlying assumptions, we assume standard technological pathways, the freight cost and relative cost between different modes remain the same across the world, and we do not take into account anything about alternative trade routes. Do we have potential Arctic shipping? Will that change something? What's going to happen with the new Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road initiative? We're not looking at the moment, major transformation of global logistics change. Are we going to see nearshoring instead of offshoring of activities closer to the markets? What are the changes in production and consumption patterns? The famous example of 3D printing, I think that's in many cases when we talk about freight projections, the first question we get, what about 3D printing? How is that going to change the way we see freight today? So all these questions are the kind of questions where we like to get more understanding and shed some light on the potential of these disruptions as well. And finally, this is just one slide from our recent report looking at decarbonization of maritime transport by 2035. Just looking at the CO2 emissions from this maritime under alternative assumptions, results can be extremely different. First on the adjusted demand. This is something that we've modeled looking at, assuming that we are moving towards a low-carbon energy system, low-carbon economy. That means there will be a reduced number of coal and oil that will be transported around the world. So there should be an impact on transport demand. Maybe there are other impacts that we don't know that might come as well. And just the fact that looking at the different potential impacts on operational measures, the technical measures, the economic impacts and alternative fuels, the future can look very different. And it really illustrates how important it is to understand how likely different disruptions will be and what is their potential timing and impact on the overall transportation system. So what I personally look forward from this discussion is not only help us to work on the ITF Transport Outlook 2019, but also have a very interesting discussion on what are the disruptions that there are likely to happen and how the transport system is changing and what we need to take into account also as a policymakers to understand better, to prepare ourselves for those changes. So I welcome you all to ask questions, to challenge and participate, as Philip is saying, and I very much look forward to today's discussion. And some of our team is here in the audience as well. We're taking feverishly notes and trying to understand how on earth we're going to manage the disruptions in our next Outlook as well. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
You heard it. The task is to help our member countries, to help all countries think long term, 1 generation, 2 generations, how transport might change as a way of thinking about where they invest now, where they put policy focus. That's the big picture. But really, it's all about helping us make the next Outlook. So help us out. We're going to turn to the panel now, and I'll start with Alan McKinnon. And before, Alan, you give your first, what you feel is a major disruption that we should take into account, I want to say that when we briefed the panel and when we were discussing the session, we said disruptions can be across a broad range of, have a number of different ways of manifesting themselves. They can be technologies, they can be new services, they can be changes in the way in which transport is governed, the way in which cities are governed. So that was the task that we asked our panelists to talk about. And Alan, with that briefing, what do you feel is a major disruption that we should be paying attention to when we look forward 32 years into the future?
Okay, so climate change, not in the sense we normally think of it in terms of mitigating emissions from transportation, but in 3 other respects. One is the decarbonisation of other sectors and the impact that will have on the movement of freight, for example. So as we create a new renewable energy infrastructure, and that process has begun, but will have to be ramped up over the next few decades, we'll be moving a lot of steel and concrete and so forth. Just to quote some numbers, you know, the IEA has a projection that by 2050, 18% of electricity will be produced by wind turbines. So you then work out the number of wind turbines required. That would create a demand for about 900 million tons of concrete, about 220 million tons of steel. I don't think that's currently factored into our freight models. Carbon capture and storage, again, 12% of the savings in CO2 from electricity by 2050 will be from carbon capture and storage. I worked out on that basis. We will have to capture and liquefy and transport and store 94 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. That's a lot of freight movement. Climate proofing our built environment, again, is going to be very material and transport intensive. Interesting paper published last year working out how much material we would have to move to climate proof the world's 220 largest ports. They worked out that that would represent about 20% of all the container capacity in 1 year. Resettling population, 3% of the world's population lives within 5 meters of sea level. That's 200 million people. Again, fascinating paper published last year on the sort of physical footprint of mankind on the planet that allows you to work out how much freight would be required to displace population and build new settlements. So let's suppose that we had to rebuild about 1% of, no, 0.1%, a thousandth of our current building stock worldwide. That would be equivalent to all the freight moved in Europe in 1 year. Negative emissions. Most people now feel that in terms of future emissions during the century, we're going to overshoot the carbon budget that would keep us within the 2-degree temperature agreement in COP21. And therefore, from 2040 onwards, we're going to have to start absorbing existing greenhouse gas emissions within the atmosphere. How do we do that? By bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, what we call BECCS. There's also digging up olivine and crushing it, and this silica rock will then absorb CO2 emissions. Again, that will entail the movement of vast amounts of material. And I don't think any of the things I've mentioned currently are factored into our freight models. So that's my big disruptor.
I can concur that none of that is actually integrated into the transport outlook. In addition, looking at the changes in agricultural trade patterns that could emerge with climate change. Thank you, Alan. Marius, what is your disruption?
I would like to comment on the disruptions that were already mentioned in the presentation of Jari, which are shared mobility, automation, and electrification. Now, you know that I'm a positive guy, and I really want to be optimistic. However, I'm rather dubious about the fact that it will be an easy road to reach that target of a massive adoption of sharing. Simply because at Uber as a business we see that there are a lot of legal, political and behavioral challenges on the way to get to that target actually. What's more is that if we are not getting the sharing piece right, the other two revolutions which are definitely going to come, which is automation and electrification, won't have the massive positive impact on society as a whole as we all wishing for. Why? Well, simply because if in the future it will be more easy to send your autonomous vehicle to pick up your kids at school for you or to get you a pizza in the evening, well, then you will certainly do so, which will actually result in the fact that our average car occupancy rates, which are already low today, in Europe they're around 1.6 persons per car in average, and in the States they're even down to 1.2. In the future they might drop to 0 point something, meaning that we will have plenty of ghost cars driving around town, thus adding up to congestions and emissions. And I think that's a horror scenario we all want to avoid. So sharing is really key. Same thing for electrification. At Uber, we're running a couple of dozens electric vehicle pilots around the world. And what we realize is actually that today, the electric vehicle charging infrastructure is not always fit for purpose for professional and shared use. So if you're not able today to adapt electric charging infrastructure for shared and professional use of vehicles, for the next 35 years, once again, we are going to be stuck in private car ownership, which is the dead end, and we're going to be stuck in it by design, by infrastructure design. So sharing is absolutely key. And what's more is that we have to start working and cooperating all together today to get there. And I think that's maybe one disruption or positive revolution which might be missing in the report as well, which is further integration of all mobility means. And by that I mean public transport, but also private modes such as car sharing, bike sharing, traditional taxis, and of course ride-sharing services such as Uber. And that is certainly one direction into, we believe, not only our company has to move, and we're going to build a mobility marketplace of the future where actually when you're using your Uber app in the future, the best option might be not to use an Uber at all, but actually use the app to get public transport. And that is why we really see that cities, public transport, and all kind of means of transportation have to move closer, cooperate, and move towards that future. Because we have a very, very, very limited time window to enable massive adoption of sharing before electrification and automation kicks in.
What I'm hearing, Marius, is that you're actually pointing out, I think quite eloquently, that one of the disruptions is the lack, perhaps, of disruption on the governance side. that we need a change in governance to enable some of the things that we would like to see and some of the things that might contribute to the reduction in the improvement of transport efficiency, reduction of the environmental impacts of transport. So on the governance side, I'll turn to Karen. You lead a network of cities in Europe and elsewhere that deal with a lot of issues, including disruptions that you have to manage on the ground. What do you think is a disruption that we should take into account looking forward one generation?
Well, what a coincidence. I wrote down governance because a lot of the disruptions that are listed indeed are about technology, basically. But we shouldn't forget that these technologies will be introduced, will be implemented in a certain framework, within a certain context. And that context setting, that's what our cities and regions are looking at today already for those future disruptions. So I would like to go one level up here and look at this governance framework. What we're talking about a lot within our network at the moment, which has a focus on urban transport innovation overall, is how the role of the local authority is really changing. So a local authority typically has different functions, transport functions. It can be contracting transport services, managing traffic, providing travel information. And this was really originally the preserve of the public sector. But we see today that there is really an expanding role for the private sector. You have all these third parties coming to the market, the new mobility services, for example, car and bike sharing, carpooling, and so on. And there's really a substantial growth in third-party players. You also have the open data movement, where you see that there is a very strong role for smartphone app developers, digital companies, providing traveler information in a way that is often done in a much better way than cities or regions could do themselves. So they're no longer the primary data holders, actually, and very often we see that these private players have a better picture of the state of the transport network today. And mobility as a service, I think, is one of the latest examples of where you see this happening. But this also brings me to the question what the role should be of the public transport authority in the future and in the transport system of tomorrow. Because the question we should ask ourselves is also what is the interest of the private sector? That might be very different from what the city is thinking about. So how can we make sure that all these different private sector services are also delivering when it comes to the sustainable mobility goals that the cities and the regions have? Is there a disruption in the fact that the user-centric approach that we hear about all the time these days might not be the same as the greater good that the city is thinking of and the benefits for society as a whole? So what we should be aware of is that cities will see a steering role for themselves in that respect, that they might not just allow all these disruptions and new technologies to happen as the private sector might want to see them happening, but that the city will take up a role and will make sure that through the framework that they set, these innovations will serve the policy goals that the cities have, so that we don't want citizens to move away from cycling and walking to stop using public transport and move into shared cars, because that's not the purpose of the overall sustainable mobility policy. Also, I recently received an invitation to go talk on a roundtable about automation, and the way the invitation was framed was, let's discuss how we can adapt our cities to automation. No, we should, exactly, it's the other way around. Automation should adapt to cities. And all these big promises that we hear when it comes to automated cars, you know, we may very well end up with the exact opposite effect if we don't frame them properly. We could end up with more kilometers driven because people can do all kinds of fun things while being in a driverless car. So there's really a major role here for the city to make sure that these disruptions cannot develop unimpeded, but that they develop in a way that they serve sustainable mobility goals.
That's excellent for two reasons. I like that input because we've gone 3 speakers into this panel and no one has said drones yet. So that's really good because that's a focus on technology. And I think what I'm hearing more and more is that there are super technological issues that may or may not change, but that will have a major impact on what Jari was presenting earlier. Karen, on what you just said, what I hear is that when we assume that the social compact that we have today on what we allow to happen in cities is going to be the same for the next 50 years, that is probably wrong. Cities will change what they would like to see happen in public space. And we have to think about what that change might look like, or think about some scenarios of what that change might look like, and then try to integrate that into our models, because that will have a big impact, since a lot of passenger mobility and some freight mobility takes place within urban areas. Sophie, what is your disruption?
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. I work on freight, and when I hear you speak about passenger transport, I always think freight is just one step behind, because so many of the things that are happening on freight will affect passenger. The one thing that I think all of you are familiar with, when any of you books a holiday, say to the Bahamas or to Leipzig, do you go to travel agency? 20 years ago you would, and now you don't anymore. You just look online and what's there. That is going to happen for freight as well. Whereas right now, as we still have, is middlemans, LSPs or freight forwarders who will have a sales officer going to customers and trying to organize their freight. Whereas in the future, much more of the freight, I'm not saying all of it, but much more of freight will be just looked at online. How can we get goods from A to B? For me, that's the real disruption. And that disruption is going to be facilitated by supply chain transparency. What I mean by that is that the information we currently have about a package being transported is for many people invisible, but the ICT developments that are happening now make it possible for much more of that data being collected about the type of freight, who's carrying it, how fast it's going, where it is, when it will reach the border, when it will reach the warehouse, when it will reach the customer. And those ICT systems at the moment are being developed, but they're still a little bit scattered. And the moment they start connecting, you will see a revolution, because then all this data is being connected. I think blockchain is what people are thinking of, and whether blockchain is technology, but the principle of blockchain is what will happen. Now, so its enablers is ICT. Another one is consolidation. What we're seeing more and more is that freight, while being very fragmented, players are joining together and forming bigger companies in their own. Legislation is making it very difficult for, say, small freight operators to continue operating, for example, because they need to get a Euro 6 truck instead of a Euro 3 truck, and they can't afford the investment, so they close or merge. And what I'm finding is a big enabler now is risk management. Remember the tsunami in Japan, that earthquake and then the tsunami that followed, and all of a sudden the whole world was short of certain automotive parts, and nobody realized that was happening because they had no idea where it came from. And same was happening now is with the financial crisis. Many companies found that they could take any supplier for freight that they would like. It was very much a buyer's market. Now the economy is picking up. Guess where the shortage is? Air freight transport from China to the US. You have companies really worried about how we're going to get our goods to our market, and where logistics becomes, the price of logistics can become the differentiator between am I making a loss or am I making a profit. So companies are waking up from the reality that the luxury of we can choose who we want is disappearing, and they need to manage that. The only way they can do that if they have insight in the supply chain. So the risk management from companies will want to drive for more transparency of the supply chain. Now, so one thing is the middleman will disappear, or not disappear, but I do think you will see either a lot of players, and I see that in China, small, medium road freight operators consolidating around platforms who essentially work like in airports. There's airplanes, there's airlines, but the airport manages the transport. You'll see that in freight, with a number of LSPs and either specializing in a certain part of business, like chemical transport or certain or secure transport of goods that might get stolen. And what that allows then companies to do as customers is to take better decisions with regards to freight. If I'm a multinational, say HP or IKEA or Unilever, and I have a target, I want to reduce costs, but I also want to look after the planet, all of a sudden the data that comes available to you allows you to make certain decisions that you previously could not. And in turn, it helps government to set better policy. Because right now, the development in freight, I find shocking. Transport for free. It's not for free. It's costing our planet. And that message is left to the private sector to solve, and I think there's such a big role for government to play. Big data leaves them no excuse but to act. And finally, I'd like to make a comment around the carbon side, because that's a big part of your outlook. what the risk is with whether it's carbon or whether it's safety, in other words, the softer parts of the softer values of transport, that they get overlooked, that the focus on data sharing is very much economic driven. I think we are at the forefront of a great opportunity to embed CO2, air pollution, safety from the outset in these ICT tools. I think it's a must, and I think policy has a big role to play. I think the front runners of companies who see this should really promote this. If we're able to do that, then I think that these social side or social environmental factors can and will be taken into account much better. And I think that is a must if we want to stand any chance of reaching the emission targets you're talking about now.
Sophie, thank you. I was thinking, just as you're finishing, two things. The first is that for every disruption that you've mentioned so far that we have heard on the stage, there are further implications that are just starting to pop up in my mind. When we talk about the way in which the democratization of data could take place and the digitalization of processes takes place, well, that ultimately will have an impact on the built environment. That will have an impact on where companies site, where services are consumed, how things get to places, and the value, real estate values in cities that will probably see a shift away from shopping and commerce to a more service-oriented economy. And then there'll be ongoing changes that relate to how passengers travel. So when I think about this, I see this disruption, and I get a little freaked out when we talk about how we think about this, because for each of these, there will be other linked disruptions. But that's important because we need to at least anticipate those and mention where those changes may be.
You will need to apply system thinking
Yes.
in your next report. It's only the way.
Jari, you write that down? All right, before I turn to our last and probably most disruptive speaker, I want you to prepare to tell us how we are wrong, how we should be thinking differently, and where you think we should be integrating things that you are aware of, that you are aware of through your own work or that you've heard, into a long-term outlook, 32-year, 2050 outlook in transport to help us think about what transport might look like. So Tim, what is your disruption that we should be looking at when we look one generation ahead?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here, and I really appreciate the comments of everybody else because they're pretty much what I was going to cover on. But I will start with a very broad statement and then explain what I mean. I think we're going to have a cultural revolution in the next 32 years. And what I mean by cultural revolution is it's going to be factored around automation. Automation is going to force us to change how we do business. And it's going to be fundamentally profound in ways that we can't even grasp yet. I've had the luxury of working at Google X for the last 2 years, and what I've seen there and what we were working on is profound. I can't talk a lot about it, but I can tell you it's profound. But it is all focused around automation and digitalization, as you just mentioned. I would question and push back on the need for modeling anymore on these kind of outcomes because they are an exercise sometimes in futility. And so one of the most important things that I've realized is what do we want? How do we want to get there? And what's it going to take to get there? And then that's our driving cultural factor of messaging. Everything dies because of the lack of cultural acceptance, no matter how good the opportunity and technology is. And so if we don't have the cultural values in place to message the messages that need to be said, to get the support and the acceptance of these profound changes, we're going to go backwards. And so that's my biggest concern that I have, is that we talk a good talk, we spin a bunch of data, and we say, here is a report, and I'm done. No, that's the beginning. Now how are you going to sell it? How are you going to pitch it? And how are you going to move it forward? And the area in automation is going to push us to really think about what do we value. In transportation, we have a lot of discrepancies and a lot of inconsistencies in our policies and in our processes, even in our values. What is the cost? What is the actual cost to move a person from A to B? What is the actual cost to move a thing from A to B? And what are we willing to put up for that movement of that cost? We don't do full cost accounting in transportation. We overly subsidize one transportation option and we forget about everything else. So in an ideal world of full cost accounting and full automation, you are paid to walk everywhere. You're paid to walk. You are paid to cycle. You pay to drive. You pay to have things moved from many parts of the world to you. You are paid to actually 3D print a product in your house. That is full cost accounting. That is what automation will actually force us to do. And cities will have to really think hard about what are their values and how will they defend and support those values. We talk a good game about how walking, cycling, and transit and sharing is really important. How many cities actually do that? I used to work for the city of San Francisco, and we pushed really hard to get 50% of our trips, all trips, not work trips, because a lot of our modeling focuses on work trips, how to get 50% of all of our trips by walking, cycling, and transit and sharing, and how to get the other 50 by automobile. In 2010, we had 63 by automobile and 38 by everything else. Because we created values and we pushed those values with our community, we got to 50-50 in 2015, not 2018. That's a US city that is car-centric and probably the most European city in America, but the most American city in Europe. But we did it because of that understanding of our core values, and we put our money where our mouth is. A lot of people talk about this good stuff, but I follow the money where the policy goes. So where does the money go? That's your policy. If your money's not going to what you're supposed to be doing, you actually don't have a policy about it. So automation is going to really press the button on, we have a discrepancy in moving people. A bus driver gets paid 4 times more than a person who drives somebody around in a taxi or in an Uber. A person who moves around bicycles through the bike sharing gets paid a minimum wage. What is the true cost to move a person from A to B? The same thing with freight. You get paid all these different prices based on what the product is and where it's at. But what is the actual cost that we're willing to accept as a society? And then that should be the real value that we put onto things. Because as was mentioned before, blockchain and everything else is going to make things so transparent. Companies and cities and governments have to act. There is no hiding of our problems anymore. Anybody who understands lean manufacturing, you cannot hide problems. We have so many problems in our transportation system, they're going to become very transparent. So again, I implore us to back into the scenario that we want and then figure out how to actually get there. And the cultural acceptance and the cultural values will basically be the reasoning how we get there. One last thing I want to say is about cultural values is there's been a lot of discussion about AVs. I worked on AVs for 2 years. We're launched, I've now left, are launching the world's first ride-sharing service in Phoenix with full automation. And the values that the company that I worked for had were all focused on all of the things I just talked about. And so as we see more of these come online, we're going to be really asking these questions. What do we actually value, to the point about what the cities actually think about? But are we going to defend those values? Because that's really super important. If you're in a large transit vehicle, you have a different social acceptance of behavior than if you're in a small passenger car. Imagine now a small passenger vehicle with only 2 seats that is shared, and you're not going to go into that with another person in there. What kind of conversation are you going to have? How are you going to accept that opportunity? Like, what music are you going to play? Whose preferences get overridden by the other person's preferences? These are all things that are going to be impacting how we choose to get around. So we haven't even scratched that surface, and currently our predict and provide modeling is not going to give us those answers. We have to do a lot of assumption-based back end and say, this is what we want, and then back into that and get into that.
Tim, when you say that the exercise in modeling is one that is providing diminishing returns with a highly uncertain future, I think you're right, and I think one of the things that we've tried to do in the Outlook is move away from predictive. Well, actually, we never did predictive modeling, but to think about scenarios of the future. And so, when I hear you speak, I'm thinking that the type of scenarios that we have, the type of value-laden scenarios, or scenarios that include different ways of thinking about what countries want, what cities want, will probably be multiple. because we have 59 member countries, we have different levels of development, different levels of infrastructure development, different levels of access to market, access to cities. But I take your point that we have to be thinking about what is a desirable and or possible, probable outcome, and think about what are the impacts of that. And I think, so I'm looking at Jari. we'll have to integrate that into our thinking. And I also take the point that you and Sophie are both coming together on the need for this democratization of data that allows value statements to be embedded into policy, broad value statements, not just one portion, one lobby group, but a broad democratization of value into policy making.
But they have to defend it.
Yeah, well,
they're not defending it right now.
Yeah,
and so that's yeah.
It's going to be a real battle between a few players controlling all the data, like digital colonization can be a country, can be a few companies, or it's about do we not put up with it, and we want the human rights is also data rights. You know that. I'm
going to open up a big parenthesis right now and do a shameless plug, because later on today we're issuing a report called Blockchain and Beyond, looking at the ways in which digital ledger technologies can impact mobility as a service. We didn't look at freight, but it's part of that piece of thinking about how do we democratize access, robust access to information that allows trust in interactions to go beyond certain players, but to a wide range of players. So closing that, it'll be released later this afternoon. You can find it on our website. All right, now I said that we will turn to you after hearing this first range of disruptions. All of you probably are thinking at some point about what transport might look like going forward 32 years. What I said at the outset and what Jari presented is that our assumptions in the scenarios that we developed are often based on a historic view of linkages between freight intensity and GDP, between occupancy factors and urbanization, between economic activity and the number of kilometers traveled for going to work, et cetera. Where do you think we are wrong in doing that, and how should we be thinking differently about thinking about the future of transport going one generation forward? It can be a thing, it can be a service, it can be a change in governance that you think is possible or likely or maybe even plausible. But let us hear from you. So does anyone want to provide your input? This is your chance to tell us before we put out the outlook on how we should be developing our foresight activity. Anyone? Oh, yes, sorry. Paulo Costa. Please introduce yourself.
Okay. Paulo Costa, good morning. I would encourage, I don't know if you are right or wrong. It's difficult in the sense that...
in 32 years, we'll know if we're right or wrong.
Okay. Well, if I can spend 1 minute, I worked on a scenario model in the 80s, and with Wassily Leontief, so the Nobel Prize. And at a certain moment in time, in 96, we succeeded in publishing it. The Nobel Prize, the man, Wassily, called me and says, how do they fit? Pretty good. Okay, we go ahead. Okay, in 15 years. So when you look at the scenario, you are a little bit free because you see who knows what will happen in 30 years. So but I don't want to disrupt your time in this way. I would encourage you to look into the consequences in terms of infrastructure, because by definition, any kind of disruption in services will make almost obsolete all the existing infrastructure. And if it's true, modifying infrastructure will take a long time. So there could be some kind of, a cause of resistance to the disruption to the movement. So the evolution in time of I'm much more clear idea on the freight. I would say, for instance, on the global supply chain. If it's true that will be only 20 ports dealing with the main, I would say, global movement around the world, it means all the railways connected with the rest of the ports, hundreds of ports, are absolutely useless. So we had to completely modify it. How much would it take in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of policy to adapt the infrastructure to this disruption? It seems to me there is a virtuous or vicious circle we have to take into consideration. Thank you.
Paolo, I think that's a really, really good point, because the link between infrastructure and activity has a high risk of locking in activity. Yes. And I'll just put this out before we go back to the audience, we don't have to do it that way. We can build infrastructure for, but not with, whatever it is. And I'll give an example that, Tim, you just talked about with Sue Shaheen before you came on stage. Think about parking infrastructure. If we think about the future of cities, and we think that there'll be fewer vehicles that are owned, or perhaps fewer vehicles that are allowed into the city, then parking requirements go down. If we're building a parking garage today, we should be thinking about building a structure that can be repurposed at some point in the future, because that will have an impact on that infrastructure investment, and it will also have an impact on the potential lock-in effects of having an infrastructure that is only fit for one purpose. A very practical example, parking garages are built with low ceilings. No one wants to live or work in a low ceiling environment, so you build a parking garage with high ceilings that are on standard with other living spaces and commercial spaces. That kind of thinking is something that we also saw in the climate change discussion, building for the future, but not necessarily with everything you need for a range of uncertainty. All right, so I saw okay, so back here, please. And please introduce yourself again.
Hello, my name is Katie Salamati. I'm with SAS Institute, and I very much enjoyed everyone's outlook on the outlook. But I also want to hear your comments about what needs to take place so we get to that outlook. So for example, we're going to have a period when we're going to have level 1 autonomous vehicles driving with level 5 autonomous vehicles. So there's this transition period, and I would like you guys to comment on what needs to take place so then that transition would be smoother when we get to all these futuristic ideas that you have. Thank you.
Tim, you want to take that up, and maybe if others have some ideas?
So I've been working a little bit on the transition period, about how this needs to play out. So thank you for raising that. We were only allowed to say one thing, so that's why I covered the broader umbrella. But the transition period is going to be critical to a lot of that cultural acceptance. And so we have to do a lot more public engagement in this transition period. We're going to see a profound explosion of shared services, whether it's electric bicycles, scooters, mopeds, whatever it is. They're going to get literally spread across every city because there's a new opportunity to experience that. That's going to cause a lot of resistance and reaction from city government and city governance. We're going to see a proliferation of new micro freight delivery services in cities. That's going to cause another reaction by the cities. So when the cities actually can see that this is going to happen, they need to figure out what is the transition period going to look like. A lot of it's going to be education, a lot of it's going to be inclusion of discussion, and a lot of it's going to be convenings. I founded an organization with two of my colleagues who work in the city to bring people in from both sides of the public and private sector to have a neutral space to really hash out these issues and develop new processes of thinking on how to get through this sort of stuff. Most of it comes down to public engagement. How are you going to engage the public and the community around these changes? Some of the things you mentioned about level 1 and level 5 sharing the right-of-way, a lot of that has to come down to how do we want our right-of-way to be utilized? And more importantly, if there's a risk with that 1 through 4, I'm not sure we're going to get to 5, but 1 through 4 AV services, what about the vulnerable road users? How do we protect them in this transition? So the way practically cities now, right now, today, need to start putting pen to paper and start striping bike lanes everywhere. Start putting invisible crosswalks everywhere. Start making sure that there's sidewalks, because we are talking from a very Northern American, Northern European-centric discussion on this panel, but many cities across the rest of the world don't even have sidewalks yet, footpaths. So we have to look at our baseline. What is the baseline we want people to move around with? And do we have those baselines met? And then we can talk about the nice candy stuff like level 4 autonomous vehicles. Does everybody have sidewalks first? Yes. Does everybody have protected bicycle infrastructure? Yes. Does everybody have some sort of shared mobility service? Yes. Do they have a renewable energy path that they can do some of their charging? Yes. AVs now can come in and actually work really well for you. But you don't jump from no footpaths to AVs. You need to make sure you have those baseline pieces in. So that's the transitional path.
There was another statement back here, please.
Thank you. My name is Klaus Gier. I'm from KfW, German Development Bank, and I have got a question, which may sound a bit far-fetched, but still.
We're looking for far-fetched.
For the last 80 years, I think everybody was conventional wisdom. Trade is a good thing. Integration is also a good thing. Have we seen for the last couple of 2 years a change? Tide is changing. Transport figures may see lower growth rates or even diminishing growth rates because of protectionism, quota regimes, tariffs, what have you. Will that have a bearing on the freight figures? I believe the likelihood of such a scenario is pretty low, but it may be worth look at it. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point, looking at how the political economy is changing in the world. And we can see evidence now that what we had thought was not possible could become a dominant trend in the future. So looking at the way in which trade is allowed to flow or not is something that I think we have to be thinking about going forward. Now over here, please. And please introduce yourself again.
Automotive Industry Association, ASEA. Again, the points made very valuable. There are three things I would like to ask. One is, what is the role of the people in all that? And I think it was touched upon it when you were talking about values. What we see at the end of the day, transport is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And often in these discussions, we're looking at transport as if it's an end in itself. Especially when you talk of transport of people, but also transport of goods. So how, are we gonna influence people in making these better choices when it comes to moving around themselves or moving goods? That's question one. And I think so far we failed because we overlooked some elements like convenience, which is, the number one factor for people, or cost. And you mentioned cost in some of that. That's first question. Second question is, I think if we want to look at the future will be one of combining and integrating transport modes more effectively. Again, something we have been talking about for ages. I think now, with digitalization, there's an opportunity to deliver what we have been talking. And then there also would appreciate your perspective on that aspect. How can we tap more effectively into multimodality in order to deliver on all these nice visions? Third one is stakeholder, I would say, perspective. It touches upon governance models. It's clear that today, one of the issues we are facing is this ongoing conflict in finding the right solutions and driving solutions because of different interests between the private sector and the public sector. When you talk about exchanging data, often they look at it as if it comes from the private sector, but also often the public sector doesn't want to exchange data. So again, if we are strong believers in an integrated mobility system across transport modes, we're going to have to find a way for authorities to exchange also traffic management data more effectively with the private sector and vice versa. Digitalization, again, will allow us to do that. But again, there's a lot of barriers in the current systems, including governance systems, preventing us from making that move.
I think what I'll do is I'll take a few more statements and then we'll come back to the panel. Just on that point, I think one thing not to overlook is how data science itself is changing, and that there are new ways of computing at the edge, providing information and then providing that to all players without revealing commercially sensitive or privacy sensitive data. So I think there's also a disruption in the way in which we even collect and process data that will be important to look at. So over here, please.
Yes, good morning. My name is Ajaja Morzina. I work for the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I have a reaction and a comment, well, a question. Our reaction is I very much appreciated Alan's point about the demand for new or different infrastructure because of the climate change and for having better infrastructure or replacing infrastructure that is destroyed by more and more, by higher quantities of disruptive events. But that also is a bit optimistic, knowing that we always invest in infrastructure. So especially in developing countries, it's not because the demand for infrastructure grows that we're able to meet that demand and then generate those additional volumes of construction materials that hopefully, that we know we need, but we cannot invest because there are no funds available. So that was more of a comment. And then my point, and again from the developing countries' perspective, is there's an assumption I think underlying, which maybe can be questioned, and it's perhaps a very positive way of looking at that. But I currently work in the region that wants to change what they export and what they import. They want to move away from exporting commodities, and it's a long-time dream, but we still talk about structural change, structural transformation, especially so in a very commodity-driven growth in Latin America. And what if that happened? What if in the end we actually managed to export different things and move our goods, move our commodities locally, have a more intra-regional economic exchange and so on, because that would be, I would say, in terms of freight, a big change in the game. And I think many of our many of our scenarios sort of kind of push that aside, and we continue with this something that I was taught in the school when I was still learning in the Soviet Union times, that developing countries export commodities and not much more. So those were the comments.
Just to reassure you that in the past exercises of the Outlook, we have looked at that question and tried to imagine how changes in emerging economies and developing economies will impact the direction and flow of traded goods. So there's some thinking that's already built into that. But we are, I think we need to think more maybe beyond what we've already thought, think about how that might change going forward.
And if I might just react to that, I think in many cases also in our discussion, we very much look at the impact of some of the elements in the transport sector. Technology applied to transport sector, but technology and innovation applied to automotive industry and the production of parts and all the other elements, how it actually can change the economy of a country, of a developing country at large, and not just its transport sector. I think this is something that we would very appreciate to have.
Thank you. Can I see a show of hands of who still wants to provide a statement? So we have 2 more people. I'm going to turn to the panel and answer, give your impressions on what Eric asked and that what we just heard, and then we'll go back to the room. I'll start with Alan, and Karen, I'll just let you work your way back down towards me.
Okay, just picking up on a few of the points that were made, the point about the people in all of this and the decision-making process. Again, over 35 years, you have to ask, how are we going to alter behavior at a personal level and at a corporate decision-making level? We can't assume that the same mechanisms for doing that will be the same for that length of time. I mean, if one looks at it in terms of climate change, I mean, the required reduction in emissions are so huge that we're going to have to, I think, do more draconian things. I mean, setting very high carbon pricing, using the price mechanism very effectively and combining that with regulation. And then you have to ask about politics. Will the democratic systems we have currently be in place in 20 years' time? So what is the political process and how will that impact on our ability to change behavior enough to achieve those very deep reductions? So all those things go into the mix. The point made relating to my statements about having to protect our built environment against the rigors of climate change, it's very true. I'm assuming that there will be a flow of climate finance into those parts of the world that are going to be most affected, which are predominantly in the developing world. I mean, at the moment, if you look at climate finance, it's overwhelmingly devoted towards mitigation rather than adaptation. So that will have to rebalance, it seems to me, over the next few years, to give us the resources that we need to protect our built environment and to displace population and so forth as well. There are a couple of other things which you mentioned, Philip, which we haven't discussed, like drones, for example. 3D printing also came up. Nobody has yet mentioned those things. On drones, I think we can dismiss that. I'm a drones. I mean, drones have wonderful applications.
We'll come back in 32 years on that.
Yeah, I don't see drones being used as a mass means of parcel delivery, and there isn't time to discuss that here. But 3D printing, on the other hand, I was, again, being an older guy, I'm a Luddite, so I was skeptical about the impact of 3D printing on freight flows. I've now had to change my views on that. I think we've moved from the traditional layer-based 3D printing towards things like digital light synthesis, which allows us to mass produce things using 3D printing, and that is transformational. And I do think that will have an impact on supply chains and be a beneficial effect because it can reduce the freight transport intensity of our economies.
Coming back to the comments of Erik from ASEA. So the people, yes, we shouldn't forget about the people, but ultimately they mainly think about their own interests, I think. I mean, we have our noble sides as well, but the not in my backyard syndrome plays quite strongly. So we won't be able to do it just with carrots. We'll need the sticks as well. So we'll have to take unpopular measure. And when I say we, I also mean the cities in this case. Because if we want to bring about change and we want to bring about major change, and that's clearly something we have to do, that's been mentioned before, we'll have to take unpopular measures as well, which is a politically very sensitive thing, and politicians want to be re-elected, we know that. But they also need to find the courage to take measures that will possibly limit the choices that people have in certain circumstances, or at least limit the unsustainable choices. Erik, we have engaged in a dialogue on urban vehicle access regulations. We agree to disagree on certain points, but we talk to each other, which is a major thing. And we have to regulate access to city centers to cope with the massive challenges that cities are facing. We all talk about CO2 all the time, but air quality, air pollution is the major thing in cities, and it's a big health concern. So we need to tackle that with sometimes unpopular measures. At the same time, talking about citizens, we also move a lot towards co-creation. It's a fancy word again, but so even going beyond public involvement in policy making, but really invite citizens to co-create policies and really in that respect take into account their needs and interests. And then finally, to come back to your point on multimodality, it's the year of multimodality, so definitely something to discuss and look into. It's what we are working on with our cities all the time, and I think mobility as a service really has potential in that respect. But again, we have to make sure that we also prioritize certain modes over others in this multimodal context. So when we're talking about mass, that we make sure that it's active travel and public transport first, and then the shared mobility services, ultimately the private car when no other alternatives exist. So that was my comment too.
And in a world where that happens, that will have an impact on what we're looking at going 32 years in the future, in terms of travel demand, in terms of pressure for occupation of public space as well. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think the comments that everyone's made are really important. So there's the passenger side, and there's the we call it the people and the things. On the people side, I totally agree. Digitalization is going to, again, it's going to force that hand of integration. We talk a good game about being able to like be seamless, but it's no way is it seamless, not even in places like Western Europe and even in Japan where it's almost there. So there's a lot of places that are missing. And I think taking a really good look at what people value in terms of getting around, it's quick, cheap, and easy. If it's quick, cheap, and easy, they're going to choose it. If we make it cheap, quick, and easy, they're going to choose the cheap, quick, and easy. The last 70 years, we've made driving your own car cheap, quick, and easy. So job well done. We met our vision. People say we have no vision. We had a very clear vision. It was automotive vision. We met it. Wonderful. Unfortunately, it has some massive consequences to the survivability of our planet. So the planet will out-survive us, and we may not out-survive ourselves. So we have to do a shift now and say, okay, what's the new vision? What's the new value? If it's shared electric, if it's active, shared electric, and connected, then that's a different way of making things quick, easy, and cheap. And so, again, going back to I'm a high-tech guy, but going back to the basics of walking, cycling, shared active mobility, and redefining public transit. We are so fixed on the vehicles in this society. We think of public transit as a bus or a train. Public transit must be redefined as something you use that is a shared resource, that is open to everybody. Whether it's a 2-person pod or a 150-person vehicle or a 1,000-person vehicle, it's actually going to become irrelevant. What's relevant is, Do I need to move myself to get around, or will something move me? If it's the something that moves me, that gets redefined as public transport, because it's going to serve the public. It's a big mind shift for the transit operators in the world and the governance and the providers, but that's what's going to need to happen. And on the freight side, I think we just touched on 3D printing. Many of the things that I was working on involved 3D printing, and we were fusing different alloys and materials because they didn't exist. We're using spiderweb technology, all these different things of technology to figure out how do I do things light, quickly, and easy. Again, cheap, quick, and easy is really the fundamentals. And when someone can actually do that in their house or at a community center that's a 3D center, all of that infrastructure is no longer needed. But somehow they have to get the materials to that center or their house. So how do those raw materials get used? We have tons and tons of oil embedded in solid plastics all around us, in landfills, in the ocean. We're going to have new sources of mining that are going to come out very soon. So all of these things are going to be available to us. So it's pretty exciting.
Thank you, Tim. And that gives me a really good idea of how we can talk about the scenarios in the next Outlook, which is which quick, cheap, and easy are we talking about? The one that we want, the one that we have, the one that we want to avoid. Sophie?
I'll continue on that one. What I really think is important, my recommendation to ITF Transport Outlook would be to think system thinking, make the connections and make people understand the connection, but at the same time use it to guide, especially in your role, to guide governments, that they need to set clear goals and clear boundaries. Because the risk what we have in the absence of that is that either governments all of a sudden the light switches on and they make a legislation that doesn't work for business or is running behind the facts, or it is that they're waiting to see what happens in the private sector, and then the room to maneuver once certain systems or behaviors, culture behaviors are established, is impossible to change. If people are used to ordering online, 11 o'clock is delivered the next morning, and now you're seeing same-day deliveries, and people just think, oh, it's done, it's easy, and then try and wean them off them, it's impossible. So the boundaries are so I would suggest make clear the relationship, but give clear guidance on what is the role of government now, instead of this is the future, but it's very uncertain, and then government doesn't know how to act. Second is, if I may, is a developing country. So I very much feel for your point. I've lived 15 years in developing countries myself, and I see the stark difference between here and there. But what I'm worried about is that the digital divide that we've seen, in personal computers, that we're going to see that again in transport. So that as you get digitalization, I'll give a concrete example. Right now, if you want apples in a major city in India, it is faster to get it from the US, transported to a hub in Singapore and be distributed to India, than to get it from an orchard in the Himalayas to Delhi. Yeah? The moment you add digitalization to that, if you want certainty and predictability, cost, are very important factors, it will even more introduce the behavior of let's work where it is predictable, which will put many remote developing areas even at a further disadvantage. So I think another requirement for this to work is that you bridge a digital divide on big data now and not wait. And so that's why I hope you also will put in the report is what conditions are needed for a future that we want to succeed, instead of giving possible scenarios without direction. And the final one is 3D printing. I actually work with a company in Holland. They're friends, they're drinking buddies of mine, and they've really worked on 3D printing, whereby they have started with spare parts. So they're getting, for example, automotive companies, and they're saying, you guys have spare parts hidden somewhere in a warehouse. It costs enormous storage space. You need to have 100 spare parts, where maybe in reality you only end up needing 2 or 3. Massive waste of materials. Transportation is incredible, because if spare parts are needed, it's usually for repair, so quick. And what they've done is essentially set up a network of 3D printing places. So they're like the Airbnb of that, right? They don't own the printing place, just connected them. And now they're basically doing assessments for company of what spare parts do you have, which of those are of the type of material or requirements that could be suitable for 3D printing, and how can we make you connected in this network. And what it means 30% reduction of cost. It means massive reduction in transportation, and it's the delivery times are actually reduced. And 3D printing won't be the solution for everything, but what I like about the story, and I hope you will introduce the third suggestion, stories in your Outlook about, even if we don't see the full big picture, is there somewhere an entry point where we can make something visible, tangible, that people have the feel good about, wow, it's actually possible. Something we thought was never possible is possible, even at a small scale, and expand.
I think
Yeah. And I'll pass on to Uber, but if you would have asked people, would I have done Airbnb or Uber 10 years ago, I would have said no way, and I end up using both. So
I'm really happy that we didn't ask you.
just a short reaction.
Yeah, very short reaction, and because I think I agree pretty much with everything that has been said by the panel, and I think if we want to get the right means of transportation that are in the interest not of single companies, but in the interest of the society as a whole, and we want to make those quick, cheap, and easy, then we absolutely all need to cooperate together to set the right regulatory incentives. That's absolutely key. So I won't further insist on that. To come back to the question of how do we actually get there, I'm trying to summarize this in one word, and I would say it's trust. It's trust that we need to have from the citizens. It's trust that we need to have from public and private players, such as cities and governments. And from the citizens, that means, for example, that if we are serious about providing a reliable and affordable alternative to the private car, we need to build that trust with the citizens that it's responding to all mobility means. Meaning, and by mobility means, I do not mean the need to drive a big fat sports car. I mean the need that, for example, if you're a person with reduced mobility, riding a bike might not be the best option. Talking about trust between private and public players, well, in that sense, and it comes back to what you mentioned, Karen, for example, MaaS solutions or mobility platform solutions, it's absolutely key that there is not only a one-way integration, meaning that one player integrates everybody, but there needs to be openness from different services, well, to integrate, but also to be integrated. And I think that's also the way we're moving forward at Uber. Now, last but not least, on the regulation side, and I'm not going to be long on that one, but yes, we do need carrots and sticks, and we need cities to really proactively, together with all the partners concerned, think about how does the mobility of the future look like. And it is not an absolutist solution there. Probably individual cities have individual needs, but it's really important to have that dialogue and to find a solution.
Thank you. Now, I saw that we have two more hands up for people who I will ask you in a complete reversal from what the moderator usually does at this point, not to make a question, but to make a statement about what it is that you feel we should look at in the Outlook. And please be brief, we only have 5 minutes, and I would like to go very quickly back to the panel. So we'll start on this side, and then we had another on this side as well.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Björn Pistol. I'm the head of port strategy in the port of Hamburg, Germany. And so I will try to make a statement and not a question, but your last question, how do we get there, is the one I'm thinking about it. And of course, for me, it's very, very impressive to hear how urban transport is currently changing, how eager and how ambitious the entire industry is to digitize and to automate individual transport and also individual freight. However, we as ports, our business is shipping and global trade. And we have a couple of challenges, digitization, automation, all the stuff. But one of the most becoming challenges is the climate change, because ports and shipping are one of the most relevant sources of emissions and pollutions. Therefore, we as port, as we are mostly affected by climate change, we very much appreciated the Paris Agreement to reduce the CO2 emissions by 80%. And we were actually a bit disappointed when we heard that the IMO has decided to cut or to set the goal to reduce emissions by only 50% until the year 2050, which means that they will underperform if you take the Paris Agreement as a yardstick, and which means that they will not be that ambitious eagerness, creating the future-minded set it.
So perhaps we should have a less ambitious scenario for shipping.
My question is, and I mean, it's a statement, but let me ask the question. My question is, how do we transfer this cool, fancy, eager spirit of urban transportation and digitizing automated urban transport into the shipping industry? And how do we help to overcome this conservatism? And how do we get this tomorrow spirit in the shipping industry?
Done. We will do that in the next Outlook. We will try to do that in the next Outlook. And over on this side, please, a brief statement, something you think we need to look at in the Outlook.
Thank you very much for this very interesting session to everyone. I'm Stefan Bakker. I'm working as a consultant for the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative initiated by the World Bank. I have to now swap my thinking. I was going to ask questions about technology and policy, but so I think in terms of, let's say, the freight sector, one of the key uncertainties is the total demand for freight, and you've already shown that. So I think it would be really interesting to go deeper into that. And secondly, I was going to ask about technology options in freight, like electrification of trucks and technology options in shipping. So I think that's one of the key uncertainties. And maybe then to reverse that, what could be the impact of policies at the national and the local level on let's say, the development of these technologies and the impacts?
That's a very good point, and we're looking at that already in the maritime sector, and that's built into what we're looking at. So I think I would encourage you to talk to some of the people on the panel about that, and then also to Jari or myself about how you think we can do that. We've reached the end of our session. I'm going to ask our panelists for a brief or just a one-word answer to a question I'm going to ask them. And then I'd like for you to give them and yourselves a round of applause. The question is, how do you think you'll be surprised in the future looking forward? Or do you feel that you have a fairly good grasp? So do you think you'll be surprised in the future looking at transport, things that you have not anticipated that will pop up? This is maybe a question about how confident you are in your predictive ability. One word, will you be surprised in the next generation? Marius. Yes or no? Marius?
Yes or no question?
Yes. Will you be surprised by what happens in the transport sector in the next generation?
I told you I'm an optimist, so absolutely yes, I'm going to be surprised.
Same here, yes.
Maybe.
Absolutely.
I hope so.
Right.